Hi everyone, this tutorial is something like part 2 of my previous one about introduction to stylized materials in the Eevee render engine in Blender. So if you haven't seen the previous one, you can watch it before this one if you want to learn some basics. But if you want to jump straight into this more draw-like, maybe comic-like shaders, you can do that too. It is step-by-step tutorial. I have divided this video into 3 main parts. If you want to download the final materials, you can check the link in the description to also support my channel. So the first part is about creating the basic material. We will use some wave textures to create this comic-like effect. After that we will create a second material that will have some outlines, more complex hatching, and also some interesting material for shadows on the ground. And the best part, we will animate this. Lastly, we will create an even more complex material that will show you how to combine different techniques to create the layered material that you can use in your next project. So without further ado, let's jump into a new blend file and start creating our first materials. So I will prepare a basic scene with a ground and some geometry. Let's add a sphere and move it a little bit up. Then let's add a plane and scale it a lot. I will also extrude one edge to create a background. Let's see it through the camera. Perfect. Now I will add a sun and rotate it to create nice shadows. And that's it. Add the new materials to the ground and the sphere, and we are ready to go. So like in the previous video, first I want to divide our light intensity on our sphere into separate layers. I will do this by converting our diffuse BSDF to colors with a shader to RGB node. Now, using 3 greater than nodes, I can separate layers just like this. To create a little bit more interesting transition, I can play with the normal input of our diffuse node. Let's add a noise texture, plug it into bump node height input, and then plug it into normal. As you can see, now we can play with the noise scale and the bump intensity to create different interesting effects. Now let's add our stripes. For that I will create a wave texture. I will add a mapping to it with the shortcut Ctrl+T. Remember that we need to have a node wrangle add-on enabled for that. And let's use the window output from the texture coordinate and play with the rotation value in the mapping nodes to create a nice diagonal wave texture. As you can see, by using window coordinates, we basically ignore the 3D shape and just projects our texture from the view. This creates perfect parallel lines. I am planning using mix node to switch between different widths of the wave texture. Let's first create 3 different widths, again using greater than node. Let's duplicate it 3 times, plug it in, and now we can play with values to create different thickness. Now we are ready to combine everything together. Let's add the first mix node and plug it into our layer mask and 2 wave textures. As you can see, we have our first layer. We can now repeat this process 2 more times to create complete materials. For the last one, we can choose the solid color for our highlights. I will choose white. And that's it for this material. As you can see, we have pretty nice results with just few nodes. Let's jump into the second material to create a little more complex results. For that, I will use BlenderMarket for our mesh. So the first step will be to create this hatching texture by combining 2 wave textures. But this time I want to have more irregular results to create a more hand-drawn feel. So instead of using wave texture, I'll use a noise texture that I stretch a lot in one direction. Let's add a noise texture and plug it into the texture coordinate with a mapping node. This time we will actually need two mapping nodes, one to scale our texture and one to rotate it. We will do this separately because if we try to do this in one node, we will just have different variation, not real rotation. So in the second node, let's adjust the scale like this. Then we can rotate our stripe by using the first mapping node and adjust the value in the Z rotation. Now we can increase the contrast by using a color ramp node. Perfect. We created a basic one direction hatching, and to create even more interesting results, I will duplicate this whole setup and adjust the rotation to have opposite direction stripes. To combine these two together, I will use a math multiply node. If I multiply them, I will have all black values and this nice hatch effect. So now we need to adjust the intensity of the hatching based on lighting. For that, let's just use our typical setup with diffuse BSDF, shader to RGB, and this time a color ramp instead of greater than node. I want to use a color ramp to create a more smooth transition between intensities of the hatching. Let's plug the color ramp into the greater than node. And to create even more control, let's add a map range node between the multiply and greater than node. Let's adjust the values a little bit. We can even create more than one control point in our color ramp. Okay, so the next thing that I would like to do for this material is the highlight effect, because it is pretty even now. Let's drag a greater than node from our shader to RGB and then add that to our hatching. To increase the strength of this effect, we can multiply our highlight with a math multiply node. Perfect. Now the material is looking really nice. One thing that bothers me is that there is no clear separation from the background. There are plenty of ways in Blender to do the outline, but I will show you a pretty simple one that works best on curved organic shapes. Let's add a Fresnel node. What this node basically does, it tells us if the part of the mesh is facing the window/camera or something else. So if we have faces that are perpendicular to the window view, they are displayed as white. So now let's increase the contrast by using a less than node. As you can see, we have a pretty nice outline. Let's multiply it by our current hatching and see the final results. Looks pretty nice. The last thing that I would like to do with this material is to animate this. As you can see, in this example, we have an interesting animation going on with our material. It is really easy to do, it requires minimal changes. Let's change our noise textures from hatching from 3D to 4D. It will give us an extra parameter which basically works as a seed value. Now I want to plug it into the current animation frame. To do that, I will simply add a simple value node, and instead of writing inside it a number, I will write a hashtag frame. This will allow me to get the number of current animation frame inside my materials. Now we can plug it into our W value. If I press the playback button now, as you can see, we have our animation. You can control the speed by using a multiply node here. So that will be it for the second material. I used a really similar setup to create the ground material. I just separated the shadows and used a mix node to switch between hatching and plain grey color. Let's jump to our third material to show you how you can merge a lot of different techniques into a single shader. So this is my full material. I will go into details now about how it works and explain you how you can recreate this. So, the first part is just a simple noise texture plugged into the normal mapping. It can generate really interesting results. You can also try using UV mapping or other and see the effects. After that, I used a standard diffuse BSDF plus shader to RGB to create a lighting-aware material. I used a greater than node and map range node to have a better control over the effect. To make things more interesting, I also plugged the noise texture and bump node into the normal input of the diffuse shader. Thanks to that, I can create even more interesting transitions. So, this is my first layer. What I mean when I'm referring to the layer is that I want to create a lot of different effects and combine them all together to create the final material. Kinda like drawing, when I first have a sketch, then basic shading, and then more and more details, layer after layer. So this is my second layer. As you can see, I'm using a simple wave texture. To make things more interesting, I'm using 4D noise texture to switch between objects' texture coordinates and noise to create this wiggly effect. I'm also using hashtag frame to add extra animation. To create lighting awareness, I'm using a map range node and greater than node. So we have two layers. How we can combine them? The first thing that we can do is use a subtract node. Why subtract? Because I want to make material progressively darker. So we will start with the first layer and make it darker and darker to create those interesting looking shadows. The only problem with that is that if we just subtract those two layers, we basically have a black material. To have better control over the intensity of the layer, I'm using math multiply nodes just before our subtract. If I change the values, as you can see, we can control the strength of each layer independently, which is just what we wanted. Remember that the white color is 1, so we are subtracting the white part of the texture, and the black part will stay the same. So the next layer is this diagonal hatching. I'm using the same principle as for the previous material, so you can just copy and paste it and adjust some values if you wish to. Let's add this layer. I'm again using subtract and multiply nodes for the layer control. The next layer is again normal texture coordinates, noise texture, with slightly different settings. Again, I'm using a bump node, noise texture, and typical subtract and multiply nodes. Additionally, I want to use this hatching to create highlights. So here I am using the greater than node to separate highlight and mix node to use our hatch texture. To combine it with our material, I'm using an add node with multiply to control the strength of this effect. Before, I'm also using subtract to add the same hatching texture for my shadows. So basically, I'm using add to add bright elements and subtract to add dark elements. Next layer is this noisy one. Simple setup, nothing new. You can just add these nodes and adjust values accordingly. Adding it to our main material is easy and normal as well. The last two effects that I added are our outline, same as in previous material, and the second effect, which is extra highlight. For that, I just separate the highlighted area and added it to my material. And that's it. So these are my three final materials. As you can see, Eevee is a really flexible render engine that allows you to create complex materials with a relatively simple approach. I hope you learned something new in this tutorial. If you want to download the final file, link in the description. If you want also support my channel, you can check out my Blender add-ons and asset packs, link also in the description. Thanks again for watching, see you again soon, and bye!